Thank you to the INCB for organizing this event and the BNGOC for allowing me to speak today at the Civil Society Hearing. I am Frida Ibarra, Director of Advocacy for Mexico United Against Crime, an organization dedicated to drug policy, security, and justice. My presentation will approach the challenges of cannabis regulation, focusing on the two main fronts where it's been decided, the judicial and the legislative power. In 2015, the Mexican Supreme Court declared that the absolute prohibition of adult consumption of cannabis was unconstitutional for disproportionately violating the free development of the personality. After these historic decisions, new cases reached the Supreme Court. They have generated the necessary jurisprudence so that all judges in the country were forced to abide by our highest tribunal's ruling. At the same time, the Supreme Court ordered Congress to establish a system to regulate the market for adult access to cannabis. Afterward, because Congress failed to implement such regulation of the time established by the court, the Supreme Court had to issue a general declaratory of unconstitutionality in 2021. This declaration eliminated the prohibition on administrative authorities from using permits for personal cannabis use. In theory, people who wanted authorization for the personal use of cannabis will no longer have to go to the court with the declaration. However, inequalities remain since the strategic bureaucracy of the administrative authorities continues, still refusing to grant authorizations, even though there is no legal justification for such refusal. Thus, in Mexico, even with the recognition of a right by the highest constitutional court, people continue to be subjected to the dilatory practice of the administrative authorities, and most people remain under threat of criminalization because the regulatory framework has not yet been implemented. But what explains the severe delay of Congress? The first thing is to understand that the main drivers for regulation in Mexico are not addressing the crisis of violence generated by prohibition and the so-called war on drugs, or ensuring the rights of people who use drugs as already recognized by the highest court. Unfortunately, the main driver has been creating a new cannabis market that can serve large international trading partners. This is where the factors that have made it impossible to regulate the cannabis market with a real focus on social justice come from. Although the government National Development Plan aiming to reformulate the fight against drugs, the current strategy follows the same prohibitionist inertia that the Mexican government once branded as unsustainable due to its poor public health results and the violence it has generated. On the specific issue of cannabis regulation, the contradictions within the government itself are revealed. Congress has organized forums where legislators speak about the importance of regulating cannabis and celebrate the opportunity it represents to reduce drug trafficking. At the same time, the speeches made by the executive branch contradict the supposed will of the government on this issue and reveal that the consensus required to finalize the regulation does not exist yet. The discussion in Congress is under threat from two key forces: corporate capture and culture of punitiveness. Cultural culture began even before the legislative process started, when Congress held forums where priority was given to participants from the cannabis industry in Canada and the United States, who sought to present their business model. The result was a bias towards the industry's interest in the opinions presented in the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies. The proposal initially presented in the Senate contained laws to prevent vertical integration of the market. It established a system of exclusive license to prohibit a person or their partners, shareholders, and relatives from obtaining more than one type of license. It also included social justice measures for indigenous and peasant communities most affected by criminalization or marginalization, requiring that they have access to 40% of the licenses to cultivate cannabis. However, the National American and Canadian industry lobby managed to get another project approved in the Senate plenary on November 19, 2020, which eliminated the system of the exclusive license and allowed for the transformation and commercialization of edible and drinkable products containing cannabis. Even though the Chamber of Deputies approved a new version on March 11, 2021, it gained new concessions for the industry, such as the requirement of stiff legality and traceability for participants in the licensing system, which represents an obstacle for low-income peasants to enter the market, and the elimination of the percentage of cultivation licenses for personal communities, and the incorporation of comprehensive permits that allow their holders to participate in the entire production chain. On the other hand, the culture of punitiveness in Mexico has resulted in none of the projects presented in Congress contemplating removing the substance from the penal sphere by eliminating the crime of simple possession and the crime of cultivation. Instead, the projects under discussion propose modifying the amounts of possession tolerated for personal consumption. This system of expanding their holds does not solve the problem of wasting police, administrative, and criminal resources in the persecution of users, growers, and minor drug dealers. In addition, the rulings creating a parallel system of excessive administrative sanctions that punish possession for personal use with fines of up to 50,000 pesos when the average salary in Mexico is around 7,000 pesos per month. Cultivation is also still penalized, even if people carry out this activity for their subsistence. Finally, none of the opinions presented provides key elements of a more socially just cannabis policy demanded by civil society advocates, including its punishment of criminal records, mechanisms for release or amnesty, or measures to repair the damage to the populations most affected by prohibition and the war on drugs. So there is a real risk that Mexico will suffer from a cementation in this market that will exclude small producers from participating, will protect the large international industry for national competition, and will keep the most vulnerable population subject to the criminal regime, which is for the most part economically marginalized peasants and users. So even if cannabis regulation becomes a reality, there is a risk of creating an elitist and expansive market where most people will continue to be detained and criminalized. However, it is still possible to prevent the new regulation from being captured by large corporations and reproducing or entrenching the structural inequalities caused by prohibition. It will be more difficult, although not impossible, to reverse the capture of the market when the system is already functioning, as happened in the case of markets such as alcohol or tobacco. On the one hand, the lessons learned from the regulation process in Mexico to avoid over-regulation and the unjustified use of criminal law show that restrictions must be few and effective, and they must avoid overloading the state for its enforcement, so only the riskiest activities must be controlled. Whether of an administrative or criminal nature, sanctions must always be proportionate. The criminal justice system's use should be limited as much as possible, being the last option and intended only for the most serious misconduct, such as producing to finance criminal activities. On the other hand, to avoid market capture, regulation must include social justice models and mitigation mechanisms to avoid the emergence of oligopolies and monopolies. The model can only be successful if the participants start from an equitable base. The terrible negative consequences caused by prohibition always make regulation preferable. However, I recognize that not just any type of regulation is enough, but one that focuses on public health, social justice, and human rights above economic interests. That is why I believe that Mexico offers essential lessons on how to address each of the factors that prevent good regulation from being implemented, which will be very useful for the growing numbers of countries choosing to embark on this path in the future. So it is an honor to have participated, and really thank you so much for your attention.